All right, well, welcome back, everybody. And I cannot believe who I'm about to bring up, Patrick Hill from the Grainsmith. Are you with me, Patrick?
Yes, you're with him.
Hi, my name's
How
Patrick
you doing?
Hill. I have a shop called the Grainsmith down in Walker's Point in Milwaukee. I have a couple of other epoxy professionals here with me.
We're going to let him go.
I've got Shields, applied woodworking. He's kind of my science nerd when it comes to epoxy. When I've got serious, in-depth questions, he's who I go to. And then we've got Phil Gonzalez here, and he is with Home Designs. And he does a lot of epoxy work with inlays, inlay, crushed stones, and different things like that. And that's kind of his specialty. I do a variety, really just about everything when it comes to it. But today we're going to be working with West Systems epoxy. This is my go-to epoxy. It is kind of the median. It's the median kind of epoxy for when I'm doing things like we'll be doing today in this piece of white oak. It's pretty cool. Got some bar conclusions here. It's definitely got some cracking. We'll get through doing all of that work here. Hopefully we'll get through most of the pouring today, and then tomorrow we'll do the cleanup and get ready for finishing on. Also got this piece of asphalt here that I poured yesterday. That we'll get to some of the kind of secondary pouring and kind of pulled off the tape off the backside yet. We'll get to that. Again, for the most part, West Systems is the product I'm going to be using. That will be, again, what we'll be demonstrating. Matt will discuss some of the other epoxy options that we have, that you have, and when and where and why to use it. The other materials you're going to need on that is some kind of stuff to mix the epoxy in, some stir sticks, some masking tape. What I like to use is this frog tape. It's a little bit pricey, but it really does the job for me. Some others like using this Tyvek tape. It also works very well, but can be a little bit harder to pull off. And frog tape seems to be a little bit too for me. You're going to want some rubber gloves. You'll also want to have some safety glasses, and you'll also want to have a blowtorch or some kind of flame, some denatured alcohol. I also do like to have syringes on hand to get into some of the smaller cracks and crevices. I do like to have a level on hand to make sure my surface that I'm working on is nice and level to begin with. And a little bit of a brush. This is just what I use to get in some of the crevices to dust things out. Also, a nice handy tool are these little dental picks for getting in the cracks and crevices to kind of clean them out. That's kind of what we're going to need for the materials. I'm going to start by mixing some of this West Systems Part A and Part B. One of the reasons I really like that this product is it has these handy pumps where it's 1 pump to 1 pump mix ratio, which makes everything very easy, kind of foolproof when it comes to the mixing of it. When we do mix it, we're going to want to mix it slowly, but also make sure that we're straightening all of the edges and that we are not starting too fast to incorporate too many bubbles. You want to try to keep the bubbles to a minimum. Bubbles are the enemy of epoxy. Bubbles are the biggest most difficult thing to overcome with epoxy. And that's what all these tips and tricks are trying to do, is to minimize the bubbles that you have in the epoxy after
Just speak up.
it's done. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to do 2 pumps to start, which I'm just going to fill the cracks slightly. We'll go through a few, and then.
Are you in the Bluetooth down?
Yeah, no.
Okay. Give it a try.
Come in and talk about some of the different options and materials, and when and where and why to use certain things. But I guess I am getting ahead of myself a little bit here. I do need to tape off this bottom side and pick out some of these cracks. So this is what's going to be the bottom. You can see these cracks, for the most part, are pretty clean. This one here could use a little bit of work. So I'm going to pick that out with just a dental pick. And why I do this is to try to make it just a cleaner surface for the epoxy to go into. Again, trying to minimize those bubbles, trying to get a nice consistent pour. The less things it has to fight through to get in there, the quicker it's going to soak in and just make it a nice cleaner surface. All right, that one looks pretty good. On this other side, I do think we had one here on the end that I left. I did get the other ones as well, but really just kind of want to rip this out. You can see, for me, this crack, this wood that's in there, it could look nice in there, but I would just prefer the epoxy going through and flowing nice and being nice and clean in there. So just getting some of these big chunks out. Helping again to flow a little bit better. Get my scribe here when it's a little bit tougher to move. It's a little bit stronger of a tool. But you want to be careful not to take too much of the natural shape of that crack away. But this little thing's being stubborn. There we go. So we get that good chunk out, and now we can see through the crack pretty easily, and it's nice and clean. So that'll allow light to come through later when it's all finished, rather than having some just debris basically in there. I'm going to go ahead and tape this off. I'm going to go ahead and get the stuff mixing, but in the meantime, I'm going to have Matt, while I'm doing that, come in and discuss some of the different types. So here's Matt Shields, again, of Hyde Woodworking. By the way, with the epoxy, you want to mix it for at least, it says 1 minute for this, but follow the manufacturer's suggestion. I usually mix it for at least 2 or 3 minutes just to make sure it's fully mixed. Is this on?
Yeah, I mean, I think you turned that off, but it won't catch for a second. So there are a couple of different things to consider when using epoxy. And one of the biggest things that manufacturers won't tell you are that there are a lot of different properties, and that's what I would kind of call different types of epoxy. And so I made this graph to illustrate how they're different and what you use them for. And so these 4 categories are categories that I made up myself, and they relate mostly to 2 things that you can find in the instructions for all the pieces that you buy. And so the first category is regular and viscous. We've got fast and fluid, slow and fluid, and fast and viscous. I use the terms regular, fast, and slow to talk about the pot life. And the pot life is it's a measure of time from how long it takes to go from mixing into a gel state. Because epoxy comes as two separate liquids, an A and a B. You mix them together, and then they harden to become a solid. Okay. And so the viscosity or fluidity refers to how much like water or how much like molasses the liquid is once it's mixed. And so both of those two factors will be better suited towards some applications versus other ones. And so let's talk about pot life first. A fast epoxy, in my opinion, is anything that's under 40 minutes or so. You have some really fast epoxies that you can probably buy, as you may have seen at your hardware stores, like 5-minute epoxy or 10-minute epoxies. And then your slow ones are 150 minutes or longer. And so this measurement is often found on the cans themselves, and you don't really have to do much digging for this information. However, viscosity is something that's a little bit more subtle, and it's something that's a little bit hidden in the product packaging that you get with epoxy. So you have to look at what are called MSDS sheets. It's the material data safety sheets, and every manufacturer is required to have them and give all the chemical properties. Viscosity is measured in centipoise, it's CPS. And so a fluid one, which is a lot closer to water is 0 centipoise. Your fluid ones are about 100 to 600, and then your thick ones or your viscous ones are about 1,000 or more. And so the reason why I bring this up is that a really thick and viscous liquid will have a harder time getting a bubble that's trapped on the bottom of the crack out of it. If it's really fluid and it's like water, it'll evacuate a lot quicker. Similarly, a slow curing epoxy will allow you more time for those bubbles to evacuate, whereas a fast curing one will harden oftentimes before all the bubbles can get out. And so this next column here talks about where would be a good idea to use these. And so the West system is a fast and a fluid epoxy, and it's often suited for cracks and voids because you don't have a whole lot of bubbles going in, and oftentimes the filling of cracks and voids is to seal up a piece of wood before finishing, and you don't want to wait for 3 days for some epoxy to fully harden. These other categories are used for other types of applications. What are called bar top epoxies are best used for top coats, and they're the ones that are kind of the standard generic epoxies. You've got a 45 to 75 minute working time, and it's pretty viscous, so it spreads out nice and evenly. And so putting it on the top of a piece of wood will get it nice and even and level. The flow cast kit that Patrick talked about a second ago is a slow and a fluid epoxy, and it's used for filling really big voids or making those river tables. Any kind of a deep cast where you're pouring 1 or 2 inches thick. It's really slow to cure, so once you pour it, it'll stay a liquid for quite a long time. It's also not very viscous, it's very fluid, and so those bubbles will evacuate. You can get a really clear end cast afterwards. The 2 products that I use most often with this are the Epoxy, like Patrick does, and the EpoxyCast 690. It's made by Smooth On. It's another product. Finally, this last one is a little bit more of the fringe categories of epoxy that I only sometimes use. It's viscous. It's got a somewhat fast cure time, and I use it for encapsulating something. And so the epoxy reaction is one that is fed by heat, but it also produces heat. And so mixing too much at once, it'll cause the liquid to rapidly cure. It's called exotherming or thermal curing. So the manufacturers will often say don't mix more than 16 ounces, 32 ounces, 64 ounces at once. Depends on what you buy. And it's for this reason. You don't want it to start cracking. You don't want bubbles to be expelled from the piece of wood that you're trying to stabilize with epoxy. And so encapsulating epoxy is used when you want to coat the surface of something that you're prepping before you do a much deeper cast. It's a little bit more specific, but that's why I usually stick to these three for most general applications. And so I think Patrick's just about done filling this stuff up, and we'll move the camera back up to them. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the epoxy mix set a little bit, allowing some of those bubbles that were in the mixture to rise to the surface, and I'll get those popped here in a second, and then we'll start pouring. But just wanted to show you the volume of tape used here. Don't skimp on the tape. If you don't use the right tape, certain adhesives, duct tape, packing tape, a lot of different common tapes that you think would be very strong, the adhesives fail on it because of the epoxy. It eats at it, and by the time it hardens, it's created a gap in your tape and will leak out all over your floor. I've done this enough times that I no longer put plastic down on the floor. If it's your first time doing it, I'd recommend getting some plastic garbage bags or some clear plastic sheet and put that down to help prevent your floor from getting mess that you can't remove from it. But the tape is, again, pretty heavy. Any cracks that may potentially have a way to get through to the other side are covered. Some of them it's usually overkill. A lot of them don't get the epoxy to go through. But today, I know for sure that the one on the ends both go through, these go through, and this one goes through for sure. But even these smaller ones, it may find a way through, so you need to cover that escape route. Sometimes you'll have a bug hole that you think is going through, but actually comes out of the natural edge. And if you start filling that, it's just going to leak all over, and then you've got a epoxy on your edge, and you may not want that. So this here is ready to pour. I do have the epoxy here. There are just a couple bubbles on the surface in there. It's probably really hard to see. But what I use to break the surface tension when working with epoxy is denatured alcohol. Denatured alcohol is what you can use to clean up after epoxy if you get it on your hands or anything. It's a good thing to use. I put it in a little mist bottle like this. You can get them. I got this at Meijer at their travel section. It just creates a nice fine mist, and that's what you want. So I'm just going to give it, 2 little sprays, and that just took care of any of the bubbles on the surface. I'm going to give this a second now for that to evaporate. I'm going to get a syringe ready here. I'm going to use a big one. So I've got these larger syringes, and they come with a nice little metal tip here that can screw on so that I can get down in all of these little crevices really well. It's always a bit of a pain to get the stuff in there. I hate dipping it and sucking it through the tip, so I end up opening it through the back and pouring through the back, and then end up wasting a little bit. I'm going to put some gloves on here. Now's the time when you start getting a little bit messy potentially. All right, so Oops, sorry about that. This tip had epoxy in it. I must have used it before, so it's not working. Got a new one here. Want to pull the plug out, plunger. I'm just going to go ahead and pour this right in.
Look closer.
Careful with, depending on what kind of tip you got on, you may end up starting to drip out of the bottom as you're holding it vertical like this. But I just take a piece of paper towel. First, actually get this ridge cleaned up. Try to get that in enough, get the bubble to the top, and squeeze it till that bubble is out of there. There we go. And then wipe the excess away. And we've got a syringe with some epoxy, the West Systems epoxy. And again, a little more than the West Systems. The resin is 105. That's pretty much the one resin that you go with. And then there's different types of hardeners. They've got fast curing, slow curing, several different types. I use the Special Clear, which is 207. And that just gives you a nice, real clear surface. Okay, looks like we got about 15 minutes left. So we're going to keep cruising along. So I'm just going to go ahead and start pouring these into the voids and trying not to do too much over pour, but you will clean that up later. So these cracks, I'm going to go ahead and just top them off, and they'll drain down a bit. As you see here, it was very quick. These I don't have too much worry of the thermal curing, but these larger voids, you saw how big the bottom is in there. So those larger voids, we're only gonna pour about 1/4 inch. Otherwise, it can really have some real negative effects. We wait until it has gotten gummy, tacky. You can touch it, but it doesn't stick to your finger anymore. That's when I like to do the second set of pouring. We may push this one today, and if there's so little view of the bottom with this one that if it does thermal cure, I can then show you what that looks like. And it's on the bottom, so I don't think it's going to ruin this piece. So we'll push it today. But here I'm just continuing along getting these cracks, and then whatever I have left in this syringe, I'm just gonna get the edges and everything coated in those large cracks so that it creates a layer over the wood. As the epoxy heats up, it has a thermal reaction. It heats up as it's curing, and as that's happening, the wood is expanding, creating there to be less space for air in it. So it's pushing out bubbles as it's heating up, pushing out air out of the wood itself. So if you can seal that wood before you have a major pour, that'll help minimize the bubbles as well. Well, it looks like we're gonna have, I guess I've got a little bit of a cup as well to do the other sections here. So here I'm just going to kind of get it all over the edges so that it seeps down the edges and coats everything really nice. And then we're getting to the bubbles there. So we're going to redo this with what I've got left here. And I think I'm going to actually mix up another.
Phil can do that.
Yeah, Phil, do you think you can take this and just do 2 pumps of each here? Again, you want to try to coat the edges of everything so that it at least has a thin layer over everything. And then once that partially cures, it creates a barrier for the wood to not put out any more bubbles. All right, well, we got a bunch of bubbles. I'm going to actually just see if I can suck those back in a little bit. Not
You
too
just-
bad. We're good.
They'll evacuate.
Yeah. I'm in. So here's a for about a minute. So here are two things again: the denatured alcohol and flame. When you incorporate heat, it's a very dangerous, slippery slope. Sometimes it can cause more bubbles. So you really just want to hit it really fast. You don't want to keep the flame on it for too long. At this stage, it is still too early in my mind to put heat to it, so I'm going to use denatured alcohol. And if you focus here on these bubbles, you can see they'll pop on their own, but it doesn't hurt to give them a little bit of a spritz with the denatured alcohol, and it just takes care of that, any of those bubbles.
If you wait till the end of the pot life, that's usually the best time to use the torch.
Mm-hmm. So we're gonna push this one a little bit and not let it off gas as much, but again, with the limited size of this the crack on this top side, I don't think it's going to be too big of a concern. And I'm going to go ahead and just use the drip method, which is another common, or people use the pour, just pour straight out of it. But just take your stick and drizzle it on. And again, you're still trying to get all of the surfaces coated. Drip method isn't quite as neat and clean, but it does the job. This is white oak, so it's a nice hard surface that shouldn't soak in too deep. So it won't take too much sanding to clean it up. So that's about all we want to put in the larger voids, maybe a little more in this one. And then we're going to let that tack up a little bit. And then I'll finish pouring that. I'll do that overnight tonight so that tomorrow this will be all basically just topped off. And then we can open up the tape on the bottom and see what we're left with. And then we'll discuss more on how to do the finishing and prep work for getting the epoxy nice and flush with the wood. We go to 40.
Yep.
140.
Yep. You got about 5 minutes.
Okay. With this leftover epoxy, what I'll end up doing here is just finishing some of these cracks, but again, not putting any more into this. But I'm gonna let it sit rather than pushing this too much. And again, I'll do that overnight tonight. And then we've got this piece here. Again, kind of want to show you some of this. I haven't even opened up the tape on the back side. So this is kind of a preview of what we'll be doing a little bit with that piece tomorrow.
Face the camera.
So this one I did a little bit backwards, just because of the shape of this this void. There's this large piece. It only has a very thin amount. So this backside, you will be able to see into it. I'll put a little bit of this epoxy on it just so you can kind of see what's in there. And that's sanded to 180, which if you're trying to do another layer, you want to have the epoxy sanded to about 180 if it's already gotten hard and cured. So that's kind of just a cool void on the inside there. This just for being able to get it done and show you the other side. I'm just going to take this off really quick. isn't what I usually do, but it'll at least serve for the purpose of today. Okay, so then this side had tape on it, so it's still a little bit rough. And again, just for being able to show you what we're working with in there. So there are a couple bubbles. Again, this is going to be the top side. I don't normally do it this way. We're filling from the bottom, so these bubbles here, they got kind of trapped in there because it wasn't, they had nowhere to go with that orientation. So perhaps I should have filled this and taped it off on the bottom side. But I just kind of wanted, I'm always testing and seeing what things make, you know, how things react to different processes. If we have time tomorrow, I'm kind of contemplating making a barrier here and then filling this void so it's actually square on this back edge with epoxy. If we've got time, we'll end up doing that. If not, I may cover that sometime on one of my on my Facebook or Instagram. Again, my business name is the Grainsmith. At the Grainsmith is my Instagram, and the Grainsmith on Facebook. I may do a follow-up on that if I don't get it done tomorrow. But it sounds like we're just about out of time. Again, my name is Patrick Hill, the Grainsmith. Thanks for joining me today. We'll get back to this project a little bit more tomorrow and do the second half of things. Thanks for coming.
All right. Hey, I don't before Patrick, can you hear me, Patrick, or not? I was gonna ask a couple questions. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. So there's a little bit of a breach in the audio in the beginning. I know you made a really good point about the tape. Could you go over the type of tape that you were using? We didn't hear it.
Sure. So the most two common types of tape used are either painter's tape or like a Tyvek style tape. If you use Gorilla tape or duct tape or packing tape, those types of tape have an adhesive that the epoxy will deteriorate that adhesive, and the epoxy will leak through and you're going to have a mess on your floor. So make sure that you're using a good quality tape and using enough of it. I use this frog tape. Again, it's not the cheapest, but I think it's worth it. And a lot of people use the Tyvek tape, but the Tyvek tape, again, kind of leaves some residue. It's just harder to remove in my mind. They both do the same thing. This does have a stronger, so if you're making a form at all, this is the tape to use. If you're just dealing with cracks and knots and things, this is just fine. Another type of tape that does work well is this 3M, the Scott's blue edge lock. It is pretty critical that it has this. It's the blue with the kind of the greenish printing on it. Where's that other logo that you use for the floor? Yeah, we're good. Anyways, it's the baseboard and trim board style that 3M makes that works really good. But be careful. Make sure you tape off enough, and put a drop cloth down that's a plastic and has no holes in it, so that your floor doesn't. Whatever you get on your floor, it's not going to come off. Also, a big thing on then this workbench that I'm working on, it has see-through. You can see through to the bottom. I do it on that. If you do it on a regular solid workbench and you put this and you have any leaks, you're going to glue your piece right to your workbench. You're never going to get it off. So I like to have these that I can check in on the bottom, make sure no leaks are happening, but lift it up off your table surface at least an inch or so you can get under it if need be.
If you wanted, you could use the Tyvek tape for the nonstick.
Yeah. And the Tyvek also would work if you coated a piece of wood with the Tyvek to use as an edge piece. It'll release from the Tyvek really well. But that's about it on tape.
Well, it sounds like when you're talking about the table that you're on. So, the first time did you glue one to the table? Is that why you know to lift it up now?
Very close. I got to it just in time when it was still tacky enough that I was able to peel it off. But man, it makes a mess. It can really make a mess if this stuff leaks out on you. So that's again why I don't skimp on the tape, and I don't skimp when I'm applying it either. More the better. Make sure you got it taped.
Yeah, it sounds like critical there is tape, tape, and then more tape is what I'm hearing, right?
Right.
It
And then
may
maybe
seem
something
like
I glossed over a little bit to help with the tape is the surface prep of the actual wood. This piece I sanded to 120 grit to start. Even if it comes out of a planer, oftentimes there's little grooves that make it hard for the tape to fully adhere to the surface. So you do want to have a real nice clean surface that you're taping to begin with. So if you've got a rough slab or a rough piece of wood, make sure you clean it up so that your tape's actually going to stick. That's another way that you can have major leakage happening.
Sure. Now, after sanding, do you clean it with something special or just wipe it off so that obviously you don't want to put a chemical on, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, so denatured alcohol is a chemical you can use in conjunction with epoxy. I use these blue shop towels. I use it for a lot throughout the shop for applying finish and stuff. It's a great thing. There's always the debate between compressed air or vacuum. A lot of people, both of these guys here, super clean guys and like the vacuum because it doesn't blow all the particulate in the air. I've got a pretty good size shop here that has good airflow, so I blow out with compressed air from the air compressor to clean off the surface prior.
Excellent. And as we leave you here, what can we expect to see tomorrow?
We're going to finish this piece up with, again, tonight I'm going to finish pouring this. Now is about time where I might even get off this torch. So as I'm talking, I'm going to just do a quick bit with the torch. So we're going to finish this piece up. I'll have it sanded. So it's like this surface that I showed you on the ash pack here. Again, if I've got time, I may try to get this void in, this side on here, so that this edge continues to be flush across, and then it would be square, so that this back edge could then mount to a wall and be flush. So I think that's going to be the big hope. I don't think it's going to take too much time to explain how I actually finish up with the prepping the surface for actually applying a finish once there's a epoxy on it. So I'll talk on how to clean that all up and what products to use as far as getting a nice clean finish so that you can see clearly into the resin.
Well, I tell you what, I'm anxious to see it tomorrow. So I'll look forward to catching up with you guys tomorrow. Thanks. This was fantastic.
Good deal. See you tomorrow.